Beloved brothers and sisters, today we will hear the testimony of our sister Clement Harson Ray, who was a former nun and experienced evil and many atrocious things within the traditional church that many of us know. The testimony begins like this. My name is Clement Harson Ray. I was born and raised in a devout Catholic home. From a young age, my life was surrounded by religious items, although we never had a Bible at home. I grew up without knowing God's wonderful plan of salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. No one ever explained to me that I simply needed to invite Jesus into my heart and ask Him to save me from my sins to be born again, as mentioned in Revelation 3 verse 20. Instead, all I knew was what I had been taught in catechisms and the parish school we attended faithfully. My love for God was deep, but I didn't know Him personally. I felt a great desire to dedicate my life entirely to Him. I was taught that the best way to do this was to enter a convent and become a nun. The parish priest and nuns from my parish school constantly encouraged this idea, and over time I began to consider it as my only option. I remember the day when 2 nuns from my school accompanied me home. They met with the parish priest, who in turn met with my parents. In my family, children didn't interrupt adults, but that day, with permission, I said to my parents, "Mom, Dad, I want to enter the convent." Both of them cried with joy. They were convinced that dedicating a daughter to the convent was a great service to God, and they were thrilled to know that one of their daughters had decided to pray for lost humanity. Everything seemed so exciting and religious, but none of us had the slightest idea of what it really involved. Tragically, my parents and I were manipulated by representatives of the Roman Catholic system whom we trusted blindly. We never suspected the lies and horrors hidden behind the convent doors. Thus, after months of preparation, the year 1910 arrived. I was almost 13 years old when I said goodbye to my home forever. My mother and I prepared everything, and the priest informed us that there were no nearby convents, so my parents would take me more than 1,000 miles away to a boarding school. I had never been far from my parents, and after 3 days together, saying goodbye to them left me feeling terribly alone. At that moment, I didn't understand that this farewell would be permanent. I was completely unaware. 4 years, Catholic priests had been selecting children, especially in the confessional, to plant the idea of joining the priesthood or a convent. Since the age of 7, every time I entered the church, I would go to the statue of the Virgin Mary to ask her to help me make a good confession. The priests always emphasized the importance of confessing everything, withholding nothing, if we hoped to receive absolution for our sins. I entered the convent as a sister of the Open Order when I was 13 years old. Everything seemed right, beautiful, and I had no reason to doubt. What they taught me matched what I had been told before entering. There was no reason to suspect the vast hidden areas of deception I would later discover. Soon I resumed my studies. I had just finished 8th grade and they promised me a high school and university education. However, in reality I received little more than basic nursing training. The education was provided under terrible conditions and with much coercion. Within a few months, I was pushed into training to become a bride of Christ. Just before I turned 14, the Mother Superior began pressuring me to take the white veil. She described it all as glamorous, romantic, and fascinating, telling me I would soon be the bride of Christ, dressed in a beautiful white gown during a wedding ceremony where I would receive a ring and become His bride. It wasn't hard for me to be swayed by the suggestions of the Mother Superior, who wrote to my father to inform him how much money he needed to send for my wedding dress. My father, being wealthy, sent a considerable amount. Later, I discovered it was common for them to charge 3 to 4 times the actual cost of the dress, as the nuns would buy the fabric and sew the dress themselves, keeping the rest of the money. I was always very devout, often walking through the 14 stations of the cross. But after deciding to take the white veil, my fervor increased. I wanted to be holy enough to become the bride of Christ. Every Friday I tried hard to draw closer to God. Even crawling along the way of the cross, I believed this would prepare me for the step I was about to take. My heart was filled with idealistic devotion and love for the goals they taught me would please and honor God. Like many innocent girls who embark on this path to convents each year, I believed that by dedicating my life to service and prayer, I was making a selfless sacrifice for lost humanity. The day of the symbolic wedding ceremony where I married Christ was presented as a grand act. We were taught that our families would be saved if we remained in the convent, faithfully serving the Catholic system. The concern we felt for our families, especially for those who had strayed from the faith, was manipulated by the confessor. As a child, I viewed the confessor as a divine figure, and this blind trust gave him enormous power and influence. I believed he was holy and incapable of lying. After taking the white veil, everything seemed perfect and religious. I lived in the open-order convent and saw nothing that made me suspicious. I wasn't fully subject to the priest until I turned 21, but I didn't know that at the time. Everything was carefully concealed. I was allowed to receive one letter from my family each month and to write one in return, but I knew that every letter would be read and censored by the Mother Superior. The letters I received were so heavily marked that barely anything remained legible. I often cried when I saw those crossed-out sections, wondering what my mother had wanted to tell me. Over time, I began to notice the first cracks in the convent's perfect facade. No nun who entered an enclosed convent ever left. I attempted to escape more than once, even taking spoons to the dungeons and scraping at the dirt floor in an attempt to find a way out. The tools were locked away and everything was carefully supervised. Convents like mine were constructed like prisons, designed to prevent escape. As I neared the age of 18, the Mother Superior began working with me again. These women were carefully chosen and trained to play their roles. At that time, I was making plans to leave the convent and become a nurse sister. But she had noticed my devotion and called me to her office. "Charlotte," she said, "I've been watching you. You have a strong body and sincere devotion. I think you could make a good cloistered nun. I believe you'd be willing to give up everything you love and hide behind the convent doors, sacrificing yourself for lost humanity." The Mother Superior explained that cloistered nuns had to shed their own blood as Jesus did at Calvary. I would have to be willing to endure harsh penances and live in extreme poverty for the rest of my life. I was already living in poverty, but I had no idea what becoming a cloistered nun truly entailed. My name is Charlotte Claire, and shortly after turning 21, I had to make a decision that would shape the rest of my life. The Mother Superior had called me to her office to show me some documents. By signing them, I would surrender my entire inheritance to the Roman Catholic system. The priests worked tirelessly to ensure this outcome. To attract girls from wealthy families, knowing their fortunes would go to the coffers of the system, they lured us in. I asked for time to think, and for 2 years I seriously considered it. If I made my perpetual vows, it would mean being sent to a cloistered convent, where my entire life would be dedicated to God through study, devotion, meditation, and prayer. They assured me that being closer to God would allow me to save many more souls with my prayers. I believed every word they told me, and one day, I informed the Mother Superior of my decision. I would enter the cloister. The beginning of this new phase was terrifying. They demanded I spend 9 hours in a coffin, dying to the world. They told me I would never see my family again, never return home, and would be bound to the convent forever. This was the price a 21-year-old had to pay, giving up everything she loved to win souls for God. They dressed me in a dark red velvet shroud, and a ceremony was held, presided over by the bishop. I knew that once I left that coffin, my previous life would disappear forever. I walked toward the coffin, lay inside, and 2 small nuns covered the coffin with heavy black curtains that reeked of incense. During the 9 long hours I spent inside, the nuns, priests, and the Mother Superior kept a vigil, singing ceaselessly. They explained that the purpose of this experience was to learn to die to my family, friends, and any earthly ties. I had to expel them from my heart and mind to become a better bride of God. As I lay in that coffin, my mind wandered to memories of my childhood. I thought of the dresses my mother used to make for me, the delicious meals I would never taste again, and the warm beds I so deeply missed. I cried bitterly, realizing I would never see my family again. Each tear was an agony, and the pain in my heart from the separation was almost unbearable. I trembled with sorrow and sobbed until I ran out of tears. Eventually, after hours of suffering, I managed to regain some composure and said to myself, "Charlotte, you will be the best Carmelite nun that ever existed." I had always tried to do my best for God, and now would be no different. When the experience ended, a bell rang and 2 nuns lifted the curtains from the coffin. I struggled to get out and was led to a room where I would take my perpetual vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The Mother Superior opened a small wound on my earlobe to draw blood, as the vows had to be signed with my own blood. I promised to live in extreme poverty for the rest of my life, though at that moment, I had no idea what that truly meant. I also took the vow of chastity, which forbade me from marrying legally, as according to the nuptial ceremony, I was now the bride of God. But the hardest vow of all was obedience. I pledged absolute obedience to the Pope, the Catholic hierarchy, the Mother Superior of the convent, and the convent's rules. I had no idea how broad and strict this commitment would be. After signing the vows, the Mother Superior cut all my hair with scissors, as human hair fetched a good price on the market and was sold for profit. Then she used clippers to shave my head completely. Every 2 months my head would be shaved. Keeping hair was pointless since there was no time or facilities to wash it in the convent. To complete the process of dehumanization, they stripped me of my last name and assigned me the name of a patron saint. They explained that, although I was not holy enough to be in the presence of God, I could always pray to my patron saint, and she would intercede for me. I accepted all of this as truth because I knew no better. I did not know the gospel or the living Christ. 2 months before turning 21, my life changed completely in the convent. After taking my perpetual vows, if anyone inquired about me using my given name, the response would be that this person no longer existed in the convent. Everything I was before, all my identity, had vanished. The Mother Superior read a statement comparing Jesus' suffering on earth to what the nuns had to endure in the convent. We were told that Jesus had shed thousands of tears and drops of blood, received countless blows, and pleaded for our salvation. I believed all these lies, convinced they were true. The Mother Superior also told us that if we lived in the convent without breaking any rules, when we died, we would not go to purgatory but directly to Jesus. What they didn't tell us was that it was impossible to live in the convent without breaking a rule. After signing my vows, all my personal identification was destroyed. 60 days earlier, the Mother Superior had presented me with a document to sign, not allowing me to read it, where I renounced any future inheritance. I signed it, unaware I was handing everything over to the convent. I remember that when my brother was ordained as a priest, he also gave everything he had to the church. There was no legal way to break this agreement. When I gave my life and possessions to the convent, I realized I had sold my soul for nothing. The nuns not only suffered physically but also mentally, with many of them broken by the cruel slavery they lived under. The worst part was that these women sacrificed everything and, in the end, died without knowing Christ, condemned for eternity. After signing my perpetual vows, the Mother Superior took my arm and we walked to another room. There, a priest dressed in sacred robes came to receive us. As he approached, he tried to hold my arm in a way that horrified me. Never before had a priest been so familiar with me. They had always been polite and kind. But something about his touch and look disgusted me. I pulled away completely shocked. Seeing my reaction, the Mother Superior told me that all nuns felt the same way at first, but over time I would stop feeling uncomfortable. She reminded me of the wedding ceremony I had undergone, saying that I was now the bride of God and that the priest's body was sanctified. She assured me that what was being done was not a sin. I was terrified and confused. My mind couldn't accept what they were telling me. When I was finally allowed to speak, I burst out, "Why didn't you tell me this before I took my perpetual vows?" I asked. The Mother Superior said nothing, only pressing her lips tightly together. The response was silence. My world fell apart. I couldn't believe what I was living through. My illusions had been shattered. I found myself begging the priest to let me go home, to call my father to come get me. I was ready to leave everything behind. I couldn't bear the reality before my eyes. But instead of compassion, the priest and the Mother Superior laughed at me. They found my naivete and desperation amusing, as if my suffering were a joke. In that moment, I realized there was no going back. Life as I knew it had disappeared forever. Beloved brothers and sisters, if this testimony has been a blessing to you, please like the video, subscribe, and leave an amen in the comments so we know you truly appreciate this kind of testimony. Let us continue. After being betrayed in the most painful way, I discovered what it meant to be completely alone. All communication with my loved ones and friends had been cut off, and I found myself isolated, with no one who could understand or help me. Despair engulfed me as I realized that this nightmare was not a bad dream but a terrifying reality from which I could not escape. I belonged entirely to the Mother Superior and the priests. One of those priests, with a lascivious attitude, invited me to join him in what they called the bridal chamber. But I had not entered the convent to become an impure woman, I had come to be holy. With all my being, I rejected his intimate advances, and though he persisted, I was determined to fight to the last drop of blood to preserve my virtue. When I signed those vows with my own blood, I did not understand the magnitude of what I had done. I had renounced all my rights as a human being. From that moment on, I could not sit, stand, speak, eat, or lie down without permission. My life had been completely surrendered to the control of my superiors. I could only see, hear, and feel what they allowed me to. They had turned me into a puppet, a simple machine serving the hierarchy. After this came the next step, my initiation. My passport was ready, and tickets were prepared to send me to a foreign country. 2 priests met me on the ship and covered my face with a heavy veil. They took me to the mountains to confine me in an underground cloistered convent. My initiation penance began on the 3rd or 4th day in that new convent. The Mother Superior led me through a dark tunnel to an underground room. I would no longer live on the first floor as before. Now my life would be underground. The room was cold and barely lit by the dim light of 7 candles. When my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see the body of a nun lying on a plank. She was dead. Though I was not afraid of her body, my heart ached for her. How had she come to such an end? The Mother Superior ordered me to watch over the corpse for an hour. I was to walk towards it repeatedly, sprinkle it with ashes and holy water, and say over and over, "Peace be with you." After an hour, another nun relieved me. But in the gloom, when she touched my shoulder, I jumped in fear and began to scream hysterically. That scream cost me dearly. I was severely punished, denied food and water, all for the crime of having screamed. From that moment on, I learned never to scream again. In the convent, you quickly learn to follow the rules if you want to survive. When my punishment ended, the Mother Superior once again took me to do penance. This time, she led me even deeper into the convent, through endless tunnels. We entered a large penance chamber where there was a rough wooden cross more than 2 meters long. She led me to the foot of the cross, stripped me of my clothing to the waist, and then bent my body over it. She tied my hands firmly under the cross, and it was there that I began to shed my blood, just as Jesus had on Calvary. I never imagined that what they had told me in the convent would be so literal until I lived it firsthand. That day, I learned one of the many ways suffering was inflicted. 2 nuns were given scourges made of leather straps with sharp metal pieces embedded in their ends. With those cruel instruments, they began to whip me methodically, tearing into my flesh until blood started pooling on the floor. No matter how much I writhed, there was no escape. The pain burned intensely with every strike, and though I screamed, begging for mercy, they continued without showing compassion. They were well trained to be ruthless, and I was left submerged in a sea of pain and despair. It was an unbelievable experience, but it was real. The beating seemed endless. I was completely helpless. When the Mother Superior finally released my hands from the cross I was tied to, I had already collapsed from the suffering. She seemed satisfied with the amount of blood spilled from my body. Without any consideration, I was forced to put on my clothes over my bleeding wounds and continue working throughout the day until 9 p.m. The day was hell, but no one seemed to notice my terrible agony. The teaching in the convent was clear. This kind of suffering was supposed to make us holier. They claimed God delighted in our penance. But for me, that day was only the beginning of hundreds more days of torture. When night came, I was required to undress in front of the other nuns. However, I couldn't remove my clothes because the blood-soaked garments had stuck to my wounds. It would take several nights before I could painfully and bloodily peel them off. Our bed was a simple wooden slab with no mattress or pillow. Before lying down, we had to kneel on a penitence board filled with sharp wires that pierced our knees. That was our routine. On another day, the Mother Superior led me through a long, dark tunnel for the next penance. Upon entering the chamber, I saw ropes hanging from the ceiling with metal clamps at their ends. She made me stand facing the wall and raise my arms in the air. She tightened the metal clamps around my thumbs and began turning a crank, slowly lifting me off the ground until I was left hanging. The weight of my body pressed down on my thumbs and the tips of my toes, and the pain was unbearable. She closed the door, leaving me hanging there in absolute silence. The pain was excruciating, and over time I lost track of how long I had been suspended. Hours stretched into days, and I was trapped in agony, unable to do anything. It was like being buried alive. Hunger and thirst began to torment me, and my body became swollen and exhausted. I desperately prayed to the statues of the saints, but eventually I realized they could not hear me. After what felt like an eternity, the Mother Superior returned. She placed a small pan of water and a potato on a shelf in front of me. But the pain of trying to reach for them was excruciating. My lungs felt as though they were tearing with every movement. Despite the hunger and thirst, the physical suffering made it nearly impossible to take what she offered. I knew that many nuns contracted tuberculosis. After going through this kind of torture at that moment, all I could feel was inhuman pain and the complete despair of being trapped in that endless cycle of suffering. After so much pain and tension, the only way to obtain water and food was by enduring the torture. Days later, the Mother Superior came and released me, first one thumb, then the other. I collapsed to the ground. My limbs were swollen and the pain was unbearable. It felt as if my eyes were being torn from my head, and my arms were swollen to 3 times their normal size. No part of my body was free from that searing pain, and I couldn't move. 2 monks grabbed me by the shoulders and feet, carrying me to the infirmary while I moaned incoherently. They laid me on a wooden slab and cut off all my clothing, which was soaked in my own fluids. This was part of a program designed to strip us of our humanity and turn us into senseless robots. After this episode, I couldn't walk for 2.5 months. I was convinced I was going to die. One day I was summoned again. They took me through those terrifying tunnels, not knowing the misery and pain that awaited me. Upon arriving in a room with a tall chair, they shoved me into it. They removed my headdress, forced my head forward, and tied my hands and head with a stock so I couldn't move. Then they adjusted a faucet above my head, from which drops of water fell one after another. At first, it seemed harmless, but I quickly understood the magnitude of the torture. The drops, falling on the same spot for hours, would eventually break even the strongest person. I began to writhe desperately, trying to escape the endless dripping that seemed to want to break me from the inside. The screams and cries were constant in those places of terror, but no one listened. Pleading for mercy only brought harsher punishments and penances. I saw many of my companions go insane after being subjected to this kind of torment repeatedly. Those who lost their mental faculties were confined to underground dungeons, and lies about their deaths or disappearances were fabricated to cover the truth. One day I was taken to one of those dungeons. My ankles were strapped with leather bindings attached to cement rods, and I was left standing until my strength gave out and I fainted. When I collapsed, my chest touched my ankles, and though my body screamed in pain and exhaustion, there was nothing I could do. 2 or 3 days passed without food or water, surrounded only by insects crawling over me. The convent was wrapped in solitude and betrayal. Friendship did not exist. Everyone spied on each other, and any minor infraction was immediately punished. We were taught not to trust anyone and to live in isolation, fostering constant distrust. The nuns were encouraged to betray one another to seek favors and approval from the Mother Superior. This absolute obedience was a method of total control, and we learned it the hard way. Each night before bed, we had to kneel on a penitence board filled with sharp wires, praying for lost humanity while enduring the suffering. Life in the convent was an inhumane routine. At midnight, we were awakened to go to the chapel to pray for more souls, and at 1 a.m., we returned to our cells. At 4:30 a.m., a bell would tear us from our scant rest, giving us only 5 minutes to get dressed and begin work, always barefoot. This was the daily routine in the convent. Being late to dress incurred severe punishments and penances every night at 8 p.m. To our cells, where we undressed and took 3 interwoven chains with sharp edges that hung there. We began to whip ourselves, imitating the lacerations of Christ. If any nun didn't do it correctly or if the Mother Superior suspected some fault, she would order other nuns to tie you up and brutally flog you. After such a punishment, you lost the desire to eat or drink anything because of the extreme pain. This was life in a cloistered convent, where a ruthless brainwashing system was employed, comparable to what was done in Russian concentration camps, although here it was done under the guise of religion. Meals in the convent were miserable. There were 2 long wooden tables in the dining room, and each nun had an assigned seat. We could never sit in another's place. Breakfast consisted of a cup of strong black coffee and a piece of black bread weighing exactly 4 ounces. There was no lunch, and at 5 in the evening, if we could walk on our own, we gathered for dinner. We were served a watery vegetable soup without seasoning, accompanied by 2 ounces of black bread and a cup of black coffee. 2 or 3 times a week we were given half a glass of skim milk. This monotonous diet lasted all 365 days of the year, with the sole exception of Christmas Day when we received a tablespoon of molasses, a small gift we eagerly anticipated all year. With this limited food ration, each day ended with a constant hunger pain. At night, I would toss and turn in bed, unable to sleep, wondering how much longer I could endure this torment. The system was designed to weaken us, crush our spirits, and coerce us into unquestioning obedience. Bodies would fall ill quickly, and many nuns died young under these conditions. I remember one time when, while working in the kitchen, I saw some potato peels about to be discarded. My hunger was so overwhelming that I couldn't resist and quickly hid handfuls of them in my clothes. That night in my cell I ate those peels in desperation. The next day the Mother Superior, with a smile on her face, announced that I was to perform penance. I knew that day it wouldn't be a normal penance. I was taken to a torture chamber, and after a bell was rung, 2 nuns appeared to restrain my hands and feet. They pinched my nostrils to force me to open my mouth, then made me swallow a heaping spoonful of cayenne pepper. I suffered its effects for 2 days. On another occasion, I took a piece of bread I had seen on a table for several days. I ate it secretly in my cell, but the next day the Mother Superior once again brought me to perform penance. They tied my hand and wrist to a board, then a heavy board was dropped onto my hand, causing excruciating pain. There was no escape. Stealing a simple piece of bread was considered a tremendous crime, and the retaliation was swift and cruel. Over time I learned to use tools like hammers, saws, and shovels. We carried out heavy manual labor such as digging underground tunnels, building walls, and other exhausting tasks. We often wondered how the Mother Superior always knew who had whispered in hushed tones, until we discovered that the convent tunnels were wired, allowing her to hear every word. Once I was late by only half a minute, but the punishment for this minor infraction was so severe that I never dared to be late again. The raw terror and punishment created an environment of absolute and unconditional obedience to every rule and order, no matter how trivial or unreasonable they were. Lies and deceit became a way of life, concealing such infractions to avoid even worse consequences. Each morning after getting dressed, we marched silently with our heads down to receive our daily task assignments. These could include scrubbing, washing clothes, ironing, cooking, or other heavy chores. Washing was done in old tubs, including laundering the bedding and personal clothes of the local priests. All this was done without any form of payment, a forced service we were compelled to provide. The laundry room floor was rough cement, often covered in water and soap, making it slippery. We walked barefoot as shoes and stockings were luxuries we were not allowed to have. At any moment, the Mother Superior could appear unexpectedly, filling everyone with dread, as her presence almost always meant someone would suffer. One of her favorite punishments was to force a nun to prostrate herself on the cold, soapy floor and then order her to lick long crosses onto the rough cement with her tongue. She watched with a cruel smile to ensure there was no visible sign of disgust or hesitation. If there was, the punishment was increased, requiring even more crosses to be licked. The nun's tongue would be raw and bleeding, leaving her unable to eat or drink for a day or 2 due to the pain. The Mother Superior didn't stop there. She would often return the next day and force the same nun to repeat the punishment. The hard manual labor was considered good physical discipline, but with our emaciated condition caused by constant torture and systematic hunger, We were in a state of chronic exhaustion. We were treated as their property and were expected to work for them until death. There was no compassion, only cruelty. Another frequent punishment involved crawling on our knees down a hallway multiple times. By the fifth or sixth time, my knees could no longer endure the pain, and the agony became unbearable. However, if I fainted or couldn't continue, the Mother Superior would shake me, force me back onto my knees and order me to continue. This was repeated day after day, year after year, without mercy, only cruelty. We were constantly told that penance pleased God and that our misery and suffering made Him smile with approval. Although it was hard to believe, we, who did not know the Bible or have any way to learn the truth about Jesus Christ, simply accepted what we were taught. Raised in Roman Catholic teachings, separated from our families at an early age, we only began to grasp the terrible truth and the extent of the deception over time. The convent lacked basic amenities such as bathtubs, further compounding the misery. There was only a metal trough for watering the horses, and we were allowed to bathe only when the Mother Superior ordered it. Even when I bathed, I had to keep my scapular on because we were taught that the Virgin Mary would descend to purgatory on the first Saturday after the death of a Catholic to free those who wore it. These religious fables kept us bound, unaware of any other truth. Inside the convent, there was a room with a massive painting depicting men, women, children, and even babies being tormented in the flames of purgatory. These images were so graphic they seemed real, and we were often made to meditate in front of them, convinced that our suffering helped those souls. Many days I would deliberately burn my own body and shed blood, believing I was helping to free souls from purgatory. I believed these lies with all my heart. We were taught that for every drop of blood we shed, we brought souls closer to salvation. This indoctrination often led us to harm ourselves, thinking that the more we suffered, the closer we would be to redemption. There was no hope in that place, only continuous pain, exhaustion, hunger, and eventually death. For those who know the truth of salvation through Jesus Christ, this might seem unbelievable, but if you had been brainwashed with these teachings from childhood, you too would have believed this was the ultimate truth. I lived under this deception for 10 long years before realizing the horrible truth. Gradually, I became convinced that no statue made of metal, wood, or plaster could save me. It was a shock to discover that the saints and statues I had believed in so deeply were nothing more than idols. Coming to terms with the bitter truth that it was all a lie filled my heart with bitterness. I began to think that if there was a God, He must either be dead or indifferent to what was happening to us. The long hours we spent praying sincerely at the feet of these statues were in vain. One event we always dreaded was the monthly visit of the confessor priest to the convent. Each time it was a different priest, but they were all essentially the same. I hated those days and tried to position myself at the back of the line. Over the years, I learned not to trust any priest. Everyone I met was corrupt and vile. Confession often lasted the entire day, and one by one the nuns would file in to meet with the priest. The priest, always seated on a straight-back chair, awaited each nun. If one managed to leave the room without being forced into some unspeakable depravity, she was fortunate. No one ever interrupted the priest, no matter what happened. At times, the Mother Superior would allow a drunken priest to enter and select a nun to take to a cell, where they would drink more liquor and then abuse her. The Mother Superior, a cruel and carnal woman, had given birth to several illegitimate children and always protected the priests. The priests lived comfortable lives, well-fed and strong, while we were emaciated and starving. My heart stopped when I saw the nuns I had known, devastated and emaciated, chained, filthy, and smelling of excrement. Some were already dead. These women had been condemned to a slow death, punished for persistent violations of the convent's rules or for having suffered nervous breakdowns. At that moment, I understood the magnitude of the horror surrounding me and the fate of those like me who had been trapped in this cruel and merciless system. In this place, things were handled in a hidden manner, as if everything were a garbage dump that no one else should see. I felt sick, my head spinning and my mind confused as I stumbled back, climbing the stairs where my caretaker still slept peacefully. I was relieved to find that her blood pressure and breathing were still normal. She slept well until the next day, and I stayed with her for 3 more days until she felt better. As a reward, the Mother Superior assigned me a task in the kitchen for 2 weeks, which I considered a small privilege. The kitchen was on the first floor, and although I constantly felt watched by the nuns spying through the walls, I was glad to be there. In the kitchen there was an exterior door with a double lock leading to the yard, and next to it they kept the garbage bins. On the third day while we were working, someone shook one of the bins and we all got scared. The constant silence in the convent had made us extremely sensitive to any noise. We saw a man replacing a full bin with an empty one. Quickly we lowered our gaze and continued working, afraid that someone might be watching us. Suddenly, a dangerous idea crossed my mind. Maybe I could pass this man a note asking for help. However, I had neither pencil nor paper, as they were prohibited in the kitchen. There was a notebook with a pencil chained to it, used for writing down missing items. I managed to tear off a small piece of dirty paper, and at some point during the day I wrote a few lines asking for help. Although I was trembling with fear, I could not back out now. At the end of the day, I went to the garbage bin and placed the note on top, leaving the lid open. I then broke my crucifix, left it on the shelf, and left the kitchen. Shortly after, during the daily inspection, I told the Mother Superior that I had broken my crucifix and asked for permission to go back and look for it. She angrily told me to go quickly and retrieve it. I ran toward the door, my heart pounding, and looked under the garbage bin. To my surprise, there was a folded note. As I read it, my hands trembled. The message said to leave the kitchen door open and also the large iron door with bars on the exterior wall, so I could escape. My heart raced uncontrollably as I cautiously approached the exterior door. I opened it and placed one foot on the porch, but suddenly, fear overwhelmed me. I remembered the terrible sound of the alarm that rang when a nun tried to escape and how quickly they would catch them, dragging them back and subjecting them to terrible penances. I was willing to risk enduring the same fate, but still I took a deep breath, stepped out, and closed the door behind me. I ran toward the iron door, knowing that beyond it was the freedom I so longed for. When I reached it, I pulled the door with all my strength, but it was blocked. My heart sank as I realized I had forgotten to unlock it from the kitchen. Panic took over as I thought about the tortures the Mother Superior would use to punish me for this rebellion. Despite my fear, I decided to climb the tall iron gate. My fragile body, weakened by hunger and exhausting work, barely had any strength left. I slipped several times, scraping my hands and feet on the rough metal bars. Finally, with great effort, I managed to reach the top where the sharp spikes awaited me. I knew I couldn't turn back, so I took the risk of jumping. With my long skirts tangled in the spikes, I found myself suspended in the air, swinging helplessly against the gate, caught between desperation and the hope of escape. I was more frightened than ever. I swung frantically back and forth, trying to free myself. Finally, I managed to grasp the bars of the gate with one free hand. Desperately, I released 2 or 3 of the heavy folds of my skirt that were holding me back. Suddenly, I fell to the ground with a dull thud. My skirts swirled around me as I hit the ground hard. Later, I discovered that I had compound fractures in my arm and shoulder. I was so thin that the broken bones protruded through my skin. A wave of pain enveloped me, and fortunately, I lost consciousness. I don't know how long I was there, but it was probably only a brief moment. When I regained consciousness, the pain was unbearable, especially in my shattered shoulder and arm. I turned slowly, bit my lip, and forced myself to stand up. The terror of being recaptured overcame the physical pain, driving me to keep moving as fast as I could. I was in a foreign country with no money, no friends, and a broken body. I had no idea where to go, but the desire for freedom kept me going. I walked, then ran, then walked again, still conditioned by the silence of the convent. Every little rustle of the leaves around me made me think I was being chased. Fatigue made each step more difficult. I felt nauseous, numb, and sick. Finally, I hid in a small storage building to try to sleep. I spent most of the night wandering in a feverish state, my body broken and my soul exhausted. However, the next day I decided to continue, forcing myself to move forward despite the pain. Miraculously, my escape was not discovered immediately, which gave me a small advantage. On the second day, I hid under some metal boards, but the heat of the sun was unbearable. I spent hours between pain and delirium, losing consciousness several times. On the third day, I felt on the brink of death. The fever burned through my body and my arm and shoulder were swollen and throbbing. Finally, desperate and on the verge of collapsing, I came across a small house. Setting aside my fear, I knocked on the door. A man answered, and with a hoarse voice, I pleaded for some water. He looked at me with concern and called his wife. When she appeared, I saw for the first time in years a true expression of compassion. She invited me inside and offered me a cup of cold milk. I was so hungry that I drank the cup like a wild animal, but my empty stomach couldn't hold it and I vomited violently. Automatically, I recoiled in fear, expecting punishment. However, the kind woman said nothing. Instead of reprimanding me, with tears in her eyes, she cleaned up what I had vomited and gave me a solution of warm water with sugar, feeding me slowly with a spoon. This gesture revived me and brought me a relief I hadn't felt in a long time. The man looked at my injured arm and asked how I had hurt myself so badly. I explained how I had climbed the gate and fallen to the ground. When he mentioned that I needed a doctor, I became frightened. I screamed that I couldn't pay, that I had no family or money. The man calmly reassured me that both he and the doctor were trustworthy people and not Catholic. Still trembling with fear, I resigned myself to waiting for help because I no longer had the strength to continue. Both strangers treated me with a kindness I hadn't experienced in a long time, and I collapsed in tears, exhausted by years of suffering. The elderly man hitched his horse to the cart and drove to the village to find a doctor. When the doctor arrived, he quickly examined me, shaking his head in evident anger. I was terrified and refused to say who I was or where I came from. I was afraid of everyone, fearful that someone would betray me and send me back to the convent's prison. After the doctor examined me, he looked at me in total disbelief, walking around me, observing the broken state I was in, what had once been a human being. I heard him mutter angrily, but not at me, at those who had inflicted such inhumane treatment upon me. Abruptly but kindly, he told me that I had to be taken to the hospital immediately. I began to protest, filled with fear, convinced that my enemies would find me there and drag me back. I begged him not to make me go. He patiently reassured me that no one would hurt me, but that I needed urgent medical treatment to heal my broken body. When I entered the hospital, I barely weighed 89 pounds, nearly 80 pounds less than my normal weight. I was taken into surgery because of the terrible swelling and infection in my arm, hand, and shoulder. It took more than 2 weeks for the swelling to go down, and for the bones to begin to fuse. Because they were twisted, the doctors had to break them again and straighten them, a painful procedure. The hospital staff was extremely understanding and gave me the best care. After so many years of hunger, torture, and degradation, it seemed almost impossible to believe it was real. For over a year, I slowly recovered both physically and mentally. The doctor, who had become my friend, took care of me with dedication. After several months of treatment, he sat next to me, took my hand, and said, "Well, girl, we've done everything we can to get you well. Now it's time to find out who you are and try to locate your family." His words deeply moved me, and I cried as I gave him the information he needed. After 10 weeks, he finally located my parents. Both were alive, although my mother had been paralyzed for more than 7 years. During all that time in the convent, I never received her letters, nor did they receive mine, as my captors had forbidden any communication. I had contracted bone tuberculosis and could not walk. When I recovered enough to move in a wheelchair, the doctor decided I needed a change of environment, so he took me to his home in the suburbs. His kind wife bought me my first pair of shoes and civilian clothes. During my time in the hospital, that elderly couple who had found me the night of my escape came to see me almost every day, bringing wildflowers to brighten my room. One day when I was discharged from the hospital, the couple was there to offer me a place in their home. I cried with gratitude but explained that I would go to the doctor's house instead. Despite that, I stayed in contact with both families and spent a year going back and forth between them. Eventually, the day came when I was strong enough to do simple tasks like tidying up and cleaning. Over time, the doctor helped me make arrangements to return home. I received money from various people and carefully hid it in my clothes. When the doctor took me to the train, he warned me, "Charlotte, don't touch any food or sweets that don't come from the person I've entrusted with your care." The journey was long, and after several days I finally arrived in the United States. As I neared home, emotion overwhelmed me. The train conductor helped me down with my suitcase, and when I saw the small town where I had grown up, my heart raced. The city had changed in the 24 years I had been away. I went to my father's house and rang the doorbell. An elderly, hunched, and wrinkled man opened the door. When I asked for my father, he asked who I was, and I gave him my real name, not the one from the convent. Upon hearing me, tears welled up in his eyes, and trembling, he said, "Yoki," the nickname they had given me as a child. We embraced, crying with joy. Finally, I asked about my mother. At first he was evasive, but then he took me to her room. Seeing her lying in bed, paralyzed and reduced to only 69 pounds, my mind couldn't process what I saw. I could barely believe that this pale and emaciated figure was all that remained of my beautiful and strong mother, whom I remembered with such love. Waves of nausea and darkness overwhelmed me, and I almost fainted. My father gently pulled me away and helped me into the next room, where he laid me on a bed. I cried until I soon fell into a deep sleep. The excitement of coming home, mixed with the shock of seeing my parents so broken by age and illness, was too much for me. At 2:30 p.m., I woke up in intense pain, and my father called the nurse to check on me. She advised him to call the family doctor immediately. It turned out that this doctor was my godfather, the same one who had brought me into the world. I couldn't believe it was truly me, Charlotte, until he saw the birthmark on my back. I was rushed to the hospital, where I stayed for 14 weeks to receive treatment. My father, who was a very wealthy man, paid all the bills. He also made sure to reimburse those who had helped me during my time abroad by sending them gifts and thanks. While in the hospital, I underwent a second surgery on my left hip due to the bone tuberculosis that had affected the bone. When I finally returned home, I was placed in a recliner. My father told me that my only task was to rest, eat, and recover. I tried to read books, but my mind was so unsettled that I couldn't concentrate or retain what I read. After 2 weeks of constant agitation, my doctor determined that I was having a total nervous breakdown and recommended that I be admitted to a sanatorium. My father firmly refused. He didn't want me to be away again after having been gone for so long. I was so thin and weak that my family quickly took me to the back room. When visitors arrived, they were embarrassed by my appearance, which broke my heart. I felt deep sadness and became extremely shy and self-conscious. All my brothers and sisters had lived normal lives and received a university education, while I had been in that foreign convent, praying for humanity and shedding my blood for the sins of the world. I felt that life had not been fair to me. When I started to recover a bit, one of my sisters scheduled appointments for scalp treatments, hoping my hair would grow back. After months of treatments, they finally succeeded, and one day my hair began to grow again. As I became more presentable, my family started buying me expensive clothes, and I had to relearn how to dress and behave. Eventually, my father agreed that I could move to my Uncle John's house, more than 600 miles away, to try a change of environment. Although my hair was still sparse, it deeply embarrassed me. I became a recluse, afraid of being around other people. One day, while picking up a package for my uncle, I noticed something was wrong. When I turned around, I realized that 4 men were following me. One of them called me by my convent name, which paralyzed me with terror. They quickly grabbed me and forced me into their car, making me lie on the floor, covering me. We drove out to the outskirts of a large city and stopped in front of a convent. I felt my heart sink again, gripped by terror. The men pulled me out of the car, and instead of taking me to the convent, they led me to a house next to a large church. They took me through a secret hallway to a basement, where a hidden door opened, revealing an underground tunnel leading directly to the convent. At the end of the tunnel, we were greeted by the abbess with a grim and serious look. Without saying a word, she led me to another room and harshly ordered me to lie on the floor, as if all those horrible nightmares of pain, suffering, and penance were about to repeat themselves once again. I had no choice but to obey, as I had done hundreds of times before. The abbess rang a bell, and suddenly 2 nuns appeared. One of them placed a strange object beside me on the floor. Then each nun was handed a piece of rope, and they tightly bound my hands and feet. They moved with efficiency, showing experience in this cruel task. The object they had brought turned out to be a plumber's blowtorch, though I had never seen one before and didn't know what it was. The abbess gave an order, and one of the nuns lit the blowtorch. The nuns held me by the shoulders and ankles, lifting me into the air. The abbess stood in front of me and demanded that I confess my repentance for running away from the convent and promise never to try it again. She knew I would escape again at the first opportunity, so I made no promise. Despite my screams, I was aware that nothing I said would save me from the pain that was coming. The abbess demanded 3 times that I retract, and each time I responded with a grim silence. Finally, she ordered my body to be lowered onto the flame of the blowtorch. Upon contact, I screamed and desperately struggled, trying to escape the searing heat. My clothes caught fire and the pain was unbearable. The nuns held me firmly over the flames as my skin burned. My screams echoed through the room, but there was no compassion in their eyes. After what felt like an eternity, the abbess decided that it was enough for that moment. They wrapped me in a dirty rug to put out the flames, but the damage had already been done. The pain from the burns was indescribable. My body throbbed with such misery that I could barely move. They threw me to the ground and the burnt flesh on my back slid painfully. Then they took me to the infirmary, where they laid me face down on a wooden slab with my back horribly scorched. The nuns left the infirmary and locked the door behind them. I was alone, once again a prisoner to those who had no heart or conscience. I begged for water from every nun who passed by, but they all ignored me, programmed to show no compassion. They thought I would die and I believed it too. Every second was torment and I was convinced my life would end there. After a while, the abbess called a doctor to treat my burns. I often wondered what kind of lies she had told him to explain such horrible injuries. The doctor came several times to dress my wounds, but my recovery was slow and painful. Months passed before I could walk again. When I was finally allowed to get up, they took me to the refectory to eat. But instead of assigning me a place at the table, the abbess ordered me to go to a corner. There was an adjustable shelf with my ration of coffee and bread. I had to eat standing, my nose pressed against the wall. I couldn't sit with the others, and this humiliation lasted for several months. One day I asked permission to speak with the abbess. I told her I would obey all the rules if they let me go outside for a brief period of recreation. I knew I couldn't trust her as all her promises were lies, but I wanted to at least try. The abbess promised me that one day they would let me out, but deep down I knew that would never happen. Shortly after, as part of my punishment, they took me to a metal water trough for horses, which they used as a bathtub. I was ordered to strip and put on a muslin gown. Then the abbess grabbed my head and began to push my face into the dirty water, again and again. I could barely breathe, struggling for air between each immersion. I was exhausted and felt like I would drown at any moment. After what seemed like an eternity, 2 small nuns pulled me out of the trough. My body was limp and half-conscious. They held me firmly while other nuns began to whip me with whips whose sharp tips shredded my gown and my skin. Soon my body was covered in blood, lacerated everywhere. In this place, any complaint or murmur was severely punished. There was no room for compassion or humanity, and every day was another test of the relentless cruelty inflicted upon us. Therefore, I learned to endure everything without hope of relief. I had developed a suppurating infection in my finger, which worsened every day. It was terribly swollen and painful, throbbing so much that I could no longer ignore it. It should have been punctured to relieve the pressure. That day I was assigned tasks in the kitchen, and I knew I would have my hands in hot, soapy water all day, scrubbing and cleaning. When I asked the abbess for permission to speak with her, she stared at me but eventually gave her consent. I placed my finger on the work table in the kitchen for her to see. I explained how terribly painful it was and asked if I could switch tasks with another nun to keep it out of the water until it got better. She looked at it and quickly, like lightning, she grabbed a butcher's knife. Before I realized what was happening, she violently sliced the side of the infected finger. Fortunately, the loss of consciousness made me collapse to the ground.